So it's Remembrance this Monday. I want to first ask, what do you expect the narrative to be around it all?
I think it's if you followed British militarism in the last 10 or 15 years as it relates to the wars, and particularly the way over the period of the First World War centenary, the way those years were used to kind of conflate past wars with Afghanistan and Iraq and stuff like that. If you've observed that for a long time, as I think we both have, and we've both written about it, I know at times, it will seem in many ways quite muted. The kind of slightly psychotic poppy mania has diminished over the last couple of years, and that's partly because the centenary years have passed, and it's also because we don't actively have boots on ground around the world. Obviously, we're deeply involved and complicit in various wars, but the fact we don't have boots on ground has kind of changed, I think, the tone. And you'll remember that kind of manic energy. There was a kind of manic energy for a good like 8 to 10 years there, where newscasters were attacked for not wearing poppies and stuff like that. And the poppy was a central kind of instrument in the culture war. And I think that's changed simply because we're not at war in the same way anymore. And also, those centenary years were particularly important for the kind of, they were used by those with a kind of pro-imperialist, with an imperialist nostalgia kind of mindset, as again as a kind of instrument in the culture wars. And I think that's changed. We also saw Armed Forces Day as the kind of summer remembrance, which is a completely contrived event, which Gordon Brown kind of made up just to have an extra bit of militarism in the summer. And we noticed this year, through my work at Forces Watch, that actually that was very muted as well. There wasn't actually a city named. Most years there's a city named as the kind of city of the city of armed forces there, the city of imperialism, or however you want to frame it. And that didn't happen this year. And I think a lot of this militarist stuff has almost been put back in the box. Of course, it will continue. Of course, it will still be a big event. But I think that the kind of mania which overtook the country for around a 10-year period has really diminished. So it'll be different. It'll be different this year and going forward. But maybe until the next war comes along where British troops are directly involved.
I definitely want to talk about this change in tone. It's certainly different to many other years. I mean, we've seen the images, we've seen the pundits, attack people for not wearing a poppy at the appropriate time, or the size of the poppy. We know that it has been muted. Before we get onto that, though, what does strike me is that whenever we talk about patriotism, especially around remembrance, we don't usually hear from those who've actually served. I mean, the loudest voices are the pundit class, often those who've never enlisted, having very strong opinions around it. I'm, of course, talking about legacy media. So what's your feelings towards the way in which this country navigates, or historically have navigated and treated an important date and an important reminder of the past?
Well, it's important to remember that it was always an event that was contested in the 20s. If you go back and look at the history, veterans from the First World War marched to the cenotaph with their pawn tickets because they'd sold their medals, pawn tickets in place of their medals. There was always a sense that there's the kind of the theatre of remembrance, and that beneath it there are people who are suffering. And there are other examples of that at the time. The British Legion, which is the kind of positions itself as a guardian of the poppy, was not a popular organisation. Many veterans came back and refused to join it, and they called it Haig's White Guards, after Field Marshal Haig, who was the nominal head, the butcher of the Somme, as he's also known. And they didn't want that association because the original aim of the British Legion, as it was first formed, was the idea was to put the men back under their officers. So there was a class dynamic. The British Legion, elements of the British Legion were also involved in trying to plan, or at least planning to break the 1926 general strike. It always had this kind of reactionary, pro-establishment politics in it. And actual take-up in terms of membership in the early years among veterans was actually surprisingly low, because most of them were working class, and they came back and they joined the Communist Party, they joined their trade union, they joined the Labour Party. Those were people who didn't feel their class urges. They didn't feel their class politics could be expressed through membership of the British Legion. Of course, that's changed, and the British Legion is now kind of monolithic part of the landscape of British society and British military. But it's important to understand that it was always a contested and criticised organisation. It's not new. It's not new that that's the case. Of course, the pundits are important, and I would also add that I would add that I agree that most of the really hardcore pro poppy support our troops stuff is actually not carried out by veterans. Most of that's civilians. And that's only my experience, having been on Remembrance many times, and having looked at this discourse and written about it extensively, is that the people who are really really committed to it, are really, really into it, are really kind of animated by it, are mostly civilians. And this goes all the way up into government. I remember Keir Starmer's one example in the run up to the last election. He kept talking about, oh, my granddad was in the military. And there's a point where you have to be like, well, it was conscription, Keir. Everyone's granddad was in the military. This wasn't a professional army. It was a mass army with millions of members, of course. But of course, the pundits are very important. And there was actually, I would recommend all of your viewers go and read. Samira Shackle had a really good article in the Guardian, a long read in the Guardian, talking about that historical moment of poppy mania, and what it meant. And one of the things that emerged from her research was that the usual suspects, the Daily Mail and the Sun, started to look at the discourse around the poppy as a guaranteed way to get likes through moral outrage. And that's why they wrote the story. So we also have to think about it in terms of how those parts of the heritage media operate, and the fact it's likes and shares. It's always interesting to me when you look at it in that way, because the left and people who are critical of war are often accused of politicizing remembrance. But actually, it's completely the other way around for the most part. But also, it's somehow worse than that the right and the right-wing press actually just used the poppy for likes, for outrage farming. And in that article, the Daily Mail, there's a Sun reporter, the Murdoch Press employee, quoted talking about how it was guaranteed likes. Like, if you write a story like this, you can just smash it out. We've worked on news desks. You want a quick story, do some poppy outrage. That was their attitude. That was their attitude to it, which somehow is even worse than politicizing it, because they're just using it to farm outrage. But I think that was definitely that. Those are the kind of some of the underpinning forces which drove that thing. But of course, pundits play a role in that as well, because they're also, in effect, outrage farmers. We know, we've worked in the media a while, haven't we, Curtis? We know how this works. But those are definitely factors that drove that, and probably continue to. But as we were saying, probably in a more muted way now.
Yeah, so this sort of change in tone, as you say, muted. Do you think that's synonymous with how you're seeing politicians right at the top who have also changed the narrative on war? I mean, clearly, politicians aren't screaming the war drum as much as they used to be. We've even got people like Donald Trump, who is now going to be president-elect again, is pretending he's anti-war. You've got J.D. Vance going on podcast saying, we're the anti-war movement. I don't believe it, but do you think that is synonymous with how culturally we're probably not so aggressive on militarism and Remembrance Day? Do these things all come together, or do you think it's all fragmented?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things going on there. The far right people, J.D. Vance is a veteran himself, so he should know better, and he trades off the fact he was in Iraq, even if he was only a kind of media officer or whatever. But it's actually, there's some really interesting commentary on that earlier today, I heard, and it's the way that the far right, at their most effective, find something that matters to people and they press it like a button, and they say, we can solve this. And that's a kind of classic tactic of far right politics. And of course, the far right is deeply in love with militarism, in martial ideas, because they're connected to ideas of masculinity and purity, racial and otherwise. And they have a deep nostalgia for empire because of its violence, the idea of a kind of cleansing violence that can be brought home and wielded to knock out impurities from our own society. There's a lot of complex kind of psychological stuff going on there, but fundamentally, what Trump and Vance are doing is kind of pressing the button, right? They're pressing the button and saying, we can solve this. Trump's record, there's a really good article on Jonathan Katz's blog, a brilliant American writer. His blog is called The Racket, and I commend that to all your viewers as well, where he talks about Trump's actual record on war is terrible. I mean, he expanded the wars in various ways. He dropped the mother of all bombs, so-called, in Afghanistan. He sent SEALs into Yemen. But I suppose what the interesting underpinning thing there is that the only time that liberals, the people who are now all crying because they've thrown their own election away and they want to blame everyone else, the only time that liberals kind of talked about Trump as statesman-like was when he started bombing stuff, because they're hungry for this stuff. They love a bit of bombing. Liberals are really into that kind of stuff. There's an interesting dynamic there, but there are others as well. But definitely, it's important to look at the actual record of Trump, because he will try and position himself as an anti-war candidate, and it's just not true. It just doesn't. He's a hawk like the rest of them, and it's part of that. It's not just a Donald Trump problem; it's a systemic problem. That if Kamala had been, you can remember Kamala's commentary in the run-up that she would have the most lethal, develop the most lethal, and that's very specific language. Like, that's obviously been she didn't just pull that out of the air. That's obviously something that's come out of a focus group, because we know how centrists do politics, right? They have focus groups and develop their narratives around it. But the very specific use of the term lethal, we're going to have the most lethal army in the world. Um, and this is a woman who notionally would like to think, probably would like to be seen as someone who's on the left. So we've got to look at the systemic stuff that's happening
Mm.
underneath all this, and that is Tory or Labour, Republican or Democrat. They all have a deep commitment to a violent, kinetic foreign policy, and that won't change.
I mean, without going too off topic, you're absolutely right when you brought up Kamala Harris and her speech. She said the most lethal army in the world, and this is the thing that centrists and liberals don't really understand, is that we're in a populist movement and they don't grasp it. You got Trump pretending to be anti-war, and there's Kamala Harris trotting out Liz Cheney, pissing off her own base. It's really wild stuff. And you mentioned also Keir Starmer saying, my grandfather was in the war, it was conscription, but people don't really care about that anymore. They care more about their material well-being. I am interested to know, though. I mean, you made a really good point here that the the protests against Remembrance Day isn't something new from the left. It's existed from its inception. A lot of veterans were angry about their class situation from after the war. So there's always been this sort of nagging prodding of the left saying, do you think the left are getting this wrong? Do you think there's any criticisms of the left? Of course, the right weaponize all of this, but do you think maybe there are elements of the left that allow our political rivals to define us on this? Do you think there's an instance where we don't help ourselves? Or would you say that is a load of rubbish?
Around the military and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah. There is. I don't think it's a big group of people. There are certainly people, I think, on the left, with a particular, whose politics just have a particular register where it's kind of where they're very unsympathetic to or very against the idea. They kind of see the military people as kind of cops. And that's not completely untrue. I mean, the Black Panthers actually developed a really good analysis of how the military are kind of the world police, and the police are the police at home. And if you're a black person in America in the 60s and probably now, the police and the army are the same. In fact, that they're a martial force. They're out there policing people of color. I think there's some truth in that. But I think what the left need to understand is that for whatever reason, and it's a question which has bothered me and I've tried to pin down for a long time, you don't see police mutinies generally. You don't see that. There's something about the police which makes them more reactionary and more tied to the state. And it's a complicated conversation to have, but we can have it at some point. And I think the military, you look at resistance in the military, it's much more profound and much more common than in the police. So I think when you talk about the military, you should be critical of these institutions, but you have to understand the people are there for different reasons than cops join the police force, right? It's generally a poverty draft, so-called. And we've seen a number of personnel just over Gaza, and the US isn't directly involved in Gaza. We saw that young man, Aaron Bushnell, set himself on fire. Various people in the military and within the intelligence establishment have resigned and protested and resisted very bravely, I think. And we have to understand that capacity is there within the military in a way maybe it's not within the cops. That there are whistleblowers who come forward. There are people organising, active duty people, people who are serving, organising, particularly in the US where it's much more widely reported. But there is more of a capacity, I think, maybe because of the proximity to violence, that you go to these places and you see it much more profoundly, and you're indoctrinated in a different way to the cops. So I think the left does need to understand that. It's complicated. I think there's a tendency among I don't think it's a widely held view, but there can be a tendency to be like, oh, soldiers don't care if they die. To hell with them, they're just cops. And I think there's an element of truth in it, right? It's complicated. There's an element of truth in the role of the British military and the American military is to police the world. I think that's correct. But I think we also have to understand the military personnel seem to have historically a greater capacity to resist. And if you're on the left and you're serious about engaging in like critical, nuanced arguments, I think you have to reckon with that. And just anecdotally, my experiences, well, I was part of an organisation called Veterans for Peace, which had hundreds and hundreds of veterans of all eras from World War II through to the recent wars who joined it. And they were all committed to ending war and limiting Britain's capacity to go and kill people overseas. And the anti-war movement has always had. I've written about, in my last book, Veteranhood, I write extensively about the capacity and historical examples of soldiers mutinying, rebelling, and coming to the side of their own class rather than the class that employs them directly. So we have to have those debates, I think, and not write off military people, and understand those capacities that military people have.
I agree. Now, finally, can you explain to our viewers what is Forces Watch?
So Forces Watch is a small but extremely mighty organisation which I work for on the comm side of things, and we basically monitor militarism. One of our jobs is to monitor and counter militarism. And we do that in all kinds of ways. We consider ourselves in some ways a kind of public information service. We're always trying to produce analysis and reports about what's happening, what the military is doing. And there are other parts of our work. So one of our big campaigns historically, we've been going about 12, 13 years. One of our big campaigns historically is recruiting in this country. We recruit particularly young in this country, particularly young people. The training camp for the 16-year-olds is not far from where I am now in Harrogate. I'm based in York. And the implications of that, which are that people who join very young, and they're usually the very poor, and they usually end up in the combat arms, the infantry, the killing part of the army, and they suffer on every single metric, whether it's drug abuse, domestic violence, prison, unemployment, all the bad stuff, mental health. And so that's one of our long-standing campaigns. But a lot of what we do, we also produce a podcast, Warrior Nation, which you should check out. We've produced a signal report by the same name, Warrior Nation, and various other reports on how the military, how it affects people, how it affects young people, how it targets them and recruits them. And we've got a forthcoming report about the involvement of the arms trade and the military in education in this country across various different levels of education. So we do all kinds of work. And you can check out our website and listen to our podcast, which I present, if you can stand to listen to me anymore. And we're looking at, I'll tout our next series. So we're looking at future war for the next series, what war might look like in the future. And that'll have a particular lens on developments in Gaza, actually, because Gaza, of course, is a laboratory for the Israeli arms firms, and lots of other countries, including Britain, look at their technology in terms of what they can give our troops to make them more effective in their role going around the world, invading people's countries. So we cover a lot of stuff, but yeah, check us out, check out our website and check out our podcast.
Joe Glenton, thank you.
Welcome, mate. Good to see you.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.